Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today we're going to be making 3 different watercolor backgrounds using the Peony Bouquet rubber stamp by Simon Says Stamp. This is part of the Crafty Hugs release, and it's almost a background stamp, so I'm pretty much going to cover up the entire card panel. So for this first one, I'm starting off with some Canson watercolor paper. I just added a little bit of Tombow Mono multi-glue to the back of it, let that dry. That way I can stamp multiple times without having my paper shift around in my MISTI. Of course, I forgot to take out this mouse pad type thing because this is a rubber stamp and I needed to do that and I always seem to forget. So I lined that back up, stuck that down, and I'm going to be using some Distress Oxides. So for this first one, I'm using Worn Lipstick, and I'm just inking up the flowers themselves. Obviously, I'm going to get some on the leaves, not a big deal. I'm just going to take my stamp chamois and kind of wipe them up the best I can. It's not that big of a deal if you get some on the paper or on the leaves themselves, because quite honestly, I did, and you'll see that in a minute. And the Distress Oxides are opaque, so it's going to, whatever you stamp over it, it's pretty much going to cover up any mistakes that you've made. But I got most of the ink off of the leaves before I spritzed it with some water and then stamped that down onto my card panel. Now you want to let this sit for maybe about 20 seconds or so to really let that water and that ink soak into the paper. And you can see you have a nice watercolor effect here. Of course, you can see those leaves because I didn't clean them perfectly, but like I said, it's not that big of a deal. So next I'm going to go in with the picked raspberry, and I'm just using the corner of the ink pad and kind of just putting that wherever I want. No really rhyme or reason. These colors are going to blend nicely together, but before I spritz that with water again, I am going to take my stamp chamois just to get that ink off the leaves the best I can, and then again stamp that down, leaving that sit on the paper for a couple of seconds before lifting up my MISTI door. So I clean my stamp really well here, and then I'm going to move on to the 2 greens, and I'm essentially doing the same thing with the leaves that I did with the flowers, starting off with the evergreen bough, and I'm just inking these up, again taking my stamp chamois to remove any green ink that I have on my flowers. And this is all going to kind of blend together anyway, so if there's a little bit here and there, don't worry about it. Watercolor is not supposed to be neat. It is supposed to be messy. But I did the best I could. Once again, spritz that with water and then stamped that down, leaving that sit for a couple of seconds before lifting up my MISTI door. And you can see that I accidentally took some of the ink off some of the leaves themselves. Again, not that big of a deal. It's going to spread. So finally, I am finishing off with Mowed Lawn. And I did the same thing. I'm just using the corner of my ink pad just to add a few little dots here and there onto the leaves. Once again, spritz that with some water and stamped that down. Now it is going to look a little bit different once it dries because it will dry back a little bit, but I did go ahead and put that aside to completely dry, and we'll see the finished results in a few minutes. So for the next panel, we're also going to do a watercolor look to it, but this one involves a little bit more time and effort, but not much. I'm taking another piece of watercolor paper here, and again, I put some Tombow Mono multi-glue on the back of that to let that dry so that it doesn't shift around. And this time I'm bringing out my Arteza Real Brush watercolor pens, and I'm going to color the stamp. I'm not going to color my paper, I'm going to color the stamp. So I'm going to keep all of this in here just so that you guys can see the colors that I used, but I am coloring each one of the 4 flowers differently. So for this first larger one, I'm just taking the yellow here and I am covering it all up completely, the entire thing. And then I will take this orangish color and I'm just going to add a little bit here and there. I'm pretty much concentrating on the base of all of the petals because naturally that would be darker. But honestly, once we spritz this, once we stamp this onto the watercolor paper, it's all going to kind of mesh together anyway. So for this next one here, I'm going to move on to some pinks, which you'll see in a minute here. I ended up changing my mind on this because these pinks are very, very similar. and I didn't realize how similar they really were until I actually stamped it out. But I'm doing the same thing. I took the lighter pink, or what appeared to be the lighter pink, covered up all of the petals, and then just added a little bit of that darker pink to the base of all of the petals that I could figure out what the base was. For this next one here, I am going to use a purple combination. Again, just using that lighter color to fill in all the petals, and then taking the darker one just to add a little bit of shading here and there. This is a little bit more easier, much easier actually, to go around the leaves. So I'm not really worried about getting any color onto the leaves. The real brush pens are not opaque. They are transparent. So you just have to be careful that you don't get any color where you don't want it to be. For this fourth flower here, I'm going to mix it up, and I'm going to use one of the pinks and one of the purples just to give it a little bit more variation in color. For the leaves, I'm essentially doing the same thing. Obviously, I'm going to use two different greens. Started by using the lighter green and covering up all of the leaves, and then taking the darker green. And for the leaves that are kind of just by themselves there in the center, I added a little bit of the darker green to both ends of the leaf. And for the ones that are kind of tucked behind or coming out from behind a flower, I just added a little bit of the darker color to the base of the leaf, I guess, where it would be coming out from the flower itself. So once that was all done, I went ahead and spritzed this with water once again, and then stamped that down onto my watercolor panel. I did let this sit for about 10 or 15 seconds before lifting up my MISTI door, and you can see once I do that, I do not have all that much color with the pink especially. So I ended up taking out a red, and I'm just using this very sparingly, but I just added a little bit of that to the base of the flower for the pink. So I added the pink again. Didn't really matter which pink, because as you can see, they're very similar. And then I just added a little bit of that red, spritzed it with water, and stamped it again. This is going to look completely different once it dries, but this certainly did give it more dimension. So I went ahead and put that panel aside to dry, and we'll see the finished results in just a minute. And the third panel here, I am going to work on a piece of Bristol Smooth. I wish I didn't. I wish I would have continued with the watercolor paper, but I didn't. So I added the Tempo Mono Multi Glue once again, and this one is going to be the landscape card. And I know I had a question in one of my previous videos, the difference between landscape and portrait. Portrait is basically vertical, landscape is horizontal. So I went ahead and made sure that my stamp was nice and clean and nice and dry, and I am going to stamp this out with Fade Out ink by Ink on 3, because this is going to kind of fade away, and I'm going to do some no-line watercoloring. Very, very simple no-line watercoloring. And I typically would only stamp this once because I can see it perfectly, but I did end up stamping it twice just to make sure that you guys could actually see it on camera. And I'm going to use the same colors as I've been using for the Arteza Real Brush pens, just because they're already on my desk, and why not? So a couple of reasons why I wish I didn't use the Bristol Smooth. Well, one main reason is that Bristol Smooth is only going to blend so much. It's not going to blend over and over and over. So you can't add a ton of water, which I'm fine with because I don't necessarily use a ton of water when I'm using the Bristol Smooth. However, being I stamped the image twice and it's a solid image, it was almost like the paper was already full of ink and couldn't blend anymore. So I did have a very hard time blending all of the colors, not just the greens here. And you can see that I added a little bit of the darker to the tip and brought it down a little bit with the lighter color, and then left the middle kind of blank, thinking that I could get these colors to blend and the middle would be the highlight. I was not so lucky with that. And I really do think that it was because I stamped the image, the solid image, twice. So if you do decide to do this, use watercolor paper. You'll get much better results. So what I ended up doing is I'm taking out an acrylic block and I'm just scribbling out some of the lighter green there and just adding a tiny bit of water. My paintbrush is damp. It is not wet. I wash it off each and every time, but I'm dabbing it off onto a paper towel so it's just a little bit damp. and I just picked up a little bit of that color, and it seemed to allow me to blend these colors a little bit better. And I did continue doing this throughout the entire panel with all of the color combinations that I used. So I'm just going to show you these last, or these aren't the last ones, but these are the last ones I'm going to show you of the leaves. And you can see that picking up just a little bit of that color off that acrylic block certainly does help with the blending. So moving on to one of the flowers, and I'm just going to show you a couple of the petals here. And I had the same problem. I thought maybe I was trying to be optimistic and thought maybe it was just the greens that weren't blending well. So I started with the pink, 2 pinks, and added just a little bit of that red to the base of the petal. Went in with a very damp paintbrush and tried to get these to blend, and you can see that I left the tip of the petal with no ink on it, thinking that I could spread that out. And you can see that very little of that ink is actually spreading. So I ended up having to do the same thing. I scribbled out some of the pink onto an acrylic block, and I also scribbled out a little bit of the red as well, because that red was not moving. Now this petal ended up being wonky because I couldn't get the red to blend. It had dried. I added a little bit more water. It still wouldn't blend. So it's a wonky petal. It is what it is. But I learned from that petal, and I didn't end up adding red at all to any of the petals. I just picked some up from my acrylic block and kind of just added that to the petal while it's still damp and let it spread on its own. I didn't really work it too much. And like I said, this is watercolor. It's not supposed to be perfect, thank God, because I'm certainly not a watercolorist, but this makes me feel like one. So I continued around this flower as well as the one in the upper left-hand corner with the same pink and red combination, and I used the same purple combination that I used for the previous card for the remaining 2 flowers. I used the yellow for the center of the flowers, and I didn't bother to do any blending there because they are so tiny. So now that my watercoloring is all complete, and this is the final result, and here's the other 2 panels now that they have dried, I am going to go ahead and put these together. I'm using the Deco Borders and Corners stamp set, also by Simon Says Stamp, for my sentiments, and I'm going to keep these nice and simple. I decided to add some spatters to the background of this first panel because it was looking a little plain. Once it dried, the colors really meshed together and you can't really tell the difference too much. So I added a few spatters with the picked raspberry, and then decided I was going to stamp my sentiment in black, and I also wanted to matte this onto black. So I figured I needed some black spatters as well. Well, Distress Oxide, the black soot, I don't feel that that is black at all, especially when you water it down. And I didn't really have a true black ink that would react with water that would actually be black. So I ended up taking the black Arteza Real Brush Pen, being there sitting right on my desk, and it really wasn't black, but it was good enough. So let that dry for a minute, and then I trimmed this down by 1/4 of an inch. That way I can mat that onto some black cardstock, and just matting this onto some black cardstock will really make your sentiment pop, because it will match your sentiment. It's going to make your whole overall panel pop right off the page just by having just a tiny bit of a black border. So I lined this up in my mini Misty here because I knew I would have to stamp the sentiments more than once, being this is textured paper. Lined up 3 of the sentiments from that stamp set, and I went ahead and stamped this out with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a quick drying pigment ink, but it is not immediate, so make sure that you give it a minute or 2 before you handle the panel, just so that you don't smudge it. But I did stamp that twice, and I got a pretty good impression. Once that was dry, I went ahead and matted this onto that black cardstock that is cut just a little bit larger than my panel, but still a little bit smaller than the card base itself. That way, not only do I have a black border, but I also have a white border, and that makes it pop even more. So you can see that that really stands out a little bit more, just having that little bit of a black border. Moving on to the second card here, now that this is all nice and dry, and I decided I didn't want to add black to this one because it was so watered down, the colors, that it was more of a pastel look, more of a springy look. So I decided to go with that. So I'm taking this large Friend sentiment, and I'm treating a piece of pink cardstock. This is just from my stash. I don't know what brand it is. I don't know what color it is. It's just from my stash. Treated that with my anti-static tool, stamped that out with some Versamark ink, and then sprinkled on some white embossing powder and heat set that with my heat gun. Next, I trim this down into a strip that is just a little bit bigger than the sentiment itself, just because I didn't want it to take up too much room. And before I adhered that down, I took another sentiment from that same stamp set to stamp that directly above where my sentiment strip is going to be. I brought out some Hollyhock ink, also by Simon Says Stamp, and that matches that paper pretty nicely. I kind of got lucky with that one, and stamped that skinnier sentiment, I should say, right above where that friend will be, and then popped that friend up with some foam tape, adhered this down to a white A2 size card base, and that is it for card number 2. On to the final card here. Once again, I did trim this down a little bit because I will be matting this on to black. You guys know, if you've ever watched my channel, this is something I do often. And for the sentiment for this one, I'm just going to add one sentiment strip, very skinny sentiment strip, because I really want the watercolor background to be the main focus. So once again, treated my black cardstock with some the anti-static tool, stamped it with Versamark, sprinkled on the white embossing powder, and trim that down into a skinny strip. Adhered my panel down onto the black cardstock and then onto my white card base, have that black border as well as the white border. And for the sentiment strip, I trimmed it down on one side, on the right hand side, and then on the left hand side, I trimmed it down kind of at an angle just to add a little bit more interest to it, and then pop that up with some foam tape right there in the top right. I finished off this one with some Cloud 9 Dream Drops by Nuvo, and I love these. They are iridescent. They're white and they're clear and they're iridescent. It's kind of a mix of everything, and I go a little crazy when I use these. I love the Dream Drops. So that finished off card number 3. We will take a quick look at all 3 cards that we created today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.